Welcome to another deep dive, everyone. And today we're going to be looking at some excerpts, some translated excerpts from a psychology book. And the title is, get this, Why We Always Believe We Are Right.
Quite a title.
It really is. I mean, it's kind of a given, right? Like, we all think we're right. But to see it laid out like that, it's intriguing. I'm already curious to dive in. So what do we know about this book?
Well, it was originally written in Chinese, which is interesting in itself, but what really caught my eye was the foreword. It's written by Professor Zhengmo Li, a really big name in Korean psychology. And even he was surprised by something. This book, written by a psychologist, is actually diving deep into the work of Daniel Kahneman, a Nobel laureate in economics.
Wait, hold on. A psychologist writing about an economist who won a Nobel Prize. That's a curious mix.
Yeah, and Professor Lee even mentions this in the foreword. He says it was unexpected that a psychologist won the Nobel Prize in economics. But when you think about it, it makes sense. Kahneman's research was all about how people make decisions and how often those decisions aren't really rational, even when we think they are.
So, like, even when we think we're being all logical and smart, our brains are actually playing tricks on us.
Exactly. And that's where these things called cognitive biases come in. They're like mental shortcuts our brains use to simplify decision-making, but they can also lead us to make some, well, let's just say, interesting choices.
Okay, I'm starting to see where this is going. So this book is basically a guide to all the ways our brains can trip us up.
That's one way to put it. It actually suggests there are over 145 of these cognitive biases. We won't be able to cover all of them, of course.
Oh, good. 145 that's a lot.
It is a lot, yeah. But we've picked out some of the most common and I think the most impactful ones to really dig into today.
Okay, so let's get started. I'm ready to have my mind blown wide open. Where do we begin with these cognitive biases?
Well, how about we start with something called the availability heuristic? Have you ever noticed how, like, after you see a news story about a shark attack, suddenly you're terrified of going in the ocean?
Oh, yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Even though, statistically speaking, it's still super unlikely to actually happen to me.
Right. That's the availability heuristic at work. We tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy for us to remember, especially if they're vivid or emotional. The book actually gives this interesting example from back in the 1990s with Daewoo, the Korean car company.
Oh, yeah, I remember them. Weren't they known for being kind of unreliable?
Yeah, they had a bit of a reputation for expensive repairs. So to combat this, they launched this huge ad campaign during a really hot summer, and the whole focus was on their excellent air conditioning.
So instead of addressing the whole, reliability thing, they just shifted the focus to something completely different.
Exactly. And it worked. By making air conditioning the most available information in people's minds, they basically overshadowed that whole negative perception of high repair costs. Sales actually went up, even though the cars themselves hadn't really changed.
Wow, so they basically played the psychology game and won. That's pretty sneaky.
It is, in a way. But the availability heuristic isn't always a bad thing. It can be helpful for making quick decisions, especially if you're drawing on past experiences. But it's important to be aware of how it can also skew our perceptions.
So like it can make us focus on the wrong things or make assumptions based on limited information.
Exactly. Like with that shark attack example, the real risk of getting attacked by a shark is still incredibly low, but because that image is so vivid in our minds, it feels more dangerous.
Okay, so the takeaway here is to, I guess, be mindful of what information we're consuming and how it might be coloring our judgment.
Absolutely. The next time you find yourself making a snap judgment based on a recent event or something you saw in the news, take a step back and ask yourself, am I letting the availability heuristic get the best of me? Is this really representative of the bigger picture?
Good point. We got to stay vigilant. But I have a feeling this is just like the first layer of the onion here, right? There's got to be more to this whole cognitive bias thing.
Oh, there's definitely more. Way more. For instance, have you ever judged someone's decision based solely on the outcome, even if the decision itself seemed reasonable at the time?
Can you give me an example? I'm not sure I follow.
Sure. Imagine a surgeon. They're performing a really complicated surgery, one that usually has a high success rate. But unfortunately, in this case, there are complications and the patient doesn't make it. Now, does that mean the surgeon made a bad decision?
Well, it's tragic, obviously. But if the surgery normally has a high success rate, then it doesn't seem fair to blame the surgeon for one unfortunate outcome.
Right, exactly. But that's where something called outcome bias can creep in. We tend to judge the quality of a decision based on how things turn out, rather than looking at the information that was available when the decision was made.
So it kind of get blinded by the result and forget about all the factors that led up to it.
Precisely. And this can be especially problematic in situations where luck or just plain random chance plays a role. Like, think about investing. You could make a well-informed, calculated decision, but still end up losing money due to factors outside your control.
That makes sense. I guess it's easy to look back and say, oh, that was a dumb move,
Yeah.
when in reality, you didn't have all the pieces of the puzzle at the time.
Right. So the key takeaway here is to try to separate the decision-making process from the actual outcome. A good decision doesn't always guarantee a good result, and vice versa. We need to learn to evaluate both successes and failures in a more nuanced way.
So, like, don't just focus on the end result, but also look at the logic and the information that went into making the decision.
Exactly. It's about understanding the whole picture. Think about those performance reviews at work, you know? If you're only judged on whether you hit a specific target and not on all the effort and strategic thinking that went into it, that's not really a fair assessment, is it?
That's a good point. It's easy to fall into that trap of just looking at the numbers. Okay, so we've got the availability heuristic and now outcome bias. I'm starting to see how easily these biases can sneak into our thinking without us even realizing it.
And we've only just scratched the surface. There's another one that I think you'll find really interesting. It's called the conjunction fallacy. Are you ready for a bit of a brain teaser?
Oh, bring it on. I love a good mental challenge.
All right, so imagine this. You're given a description of a person named Linda. She's 31 years old, single, outspoken, very bright. She majored in philosophy. As a student, she was deeply concerned with issues of discrimination and social justice, and also participated in anti-nuclear demonstrations.
Okay, I'm picturing her. What about her?
Now, I'm going to give you two statements about Linda, and I want you to tell me which one is more likely to be true. Statement 1, Linda is a bank teller. Statement 2, Linda is a bank teller and is active in the feminist movement.
Okay. So, based on that description, it sounds like Linda is definitely the type of person who would be involved in feminist causes. So I'd say statement 2, the one where she's a bank teller and a feminist, that's got to be more likely, right?
That's what most people say. But you've just fallen for the conjunction fallacy. Here's the thing. Being a bank teller is one thing, a single event. But being a bank teller and active in the feminist movement, that requires two things to be true at the same time.
Wait, so you're saying that even though the second option seems to fit the Linda story better, it's actually less likely because it involves more conditions?
Exactly. It's counterintuitive, I know. But statistically speaking, the simpler option, the one with fewer conditions, is always going to be more probable.
My brain is doing backflips right now. So you're saying we instinctively go for the more elaborate, detailed story, even if it makes it statistically less likely?
It seems that way. Our brains love a good narrative, right? We like to fill in the blanks and create these elaborate stories in our heads. But sometimes that can lead us astray, especially when it comes to probabilities and logic.
Wow. Okay. So the lesson here is don't get too caught up in the story. Sometimes the simpler explanation is the more accurate one.
That's a great takeaway. And this tendency to prioritize a good story over cold, hard stats, it can really trip us up in a lot of areas of life. We'll be exploring this further later on when we talk about the representativeness heuristic.
Oh man, this is getting deep. I could already see how these biases can influence everything, from how we judge people to how we make big life decisions. We definitely need to keep unpacking these before I do anything rash.
I agree. It's definitely food for thought. But for now, I think we've given our brains enough to chew on for one sitting. Let's take a little break, digest all this new information, and then we'll come back and tackle even more of these fascinating cognitive biases.
Okay, so we're back and ready to keep diving deep into why we always believe we are right. You know, it's funny, all this talk about outcomes and decisions, it makes me think about how notoriously bad I am at predicting how long things will actually take me.
Oh, you mean like that home renovation project that was supposed to take a weekend but stretched into, 3 months?
Exactly. And it's not just home improvement, it's like every project, big or small, always seems to take way longer than I initially think it will.
You've just stumbled upon another one of those sneaky cognitive biases. It's called the planning fallacy. And it's basically our tendency to underestimate how long tasks will take us, even when we have, past experience to draw from.
So it's not just me being overly optimistic. There's actually, a scientific reason for my chronic underestimation.
There is. The book actually mentions this study where they asked students to predict how long it would take them to finish their thesis. And surprise, surprise, pretty much everyone underestimated, some by a huge margin.
But students are, Notoriously bad at time management, right?
True, but it's not just students. This bias affects all of us, whether you're a seasoned professional or, well, someone who's maybe a little too eager to start that next DIY project.
So what is it about our brains that makes us such bad planners?
Well, one theory is that we tend to focus on the ideal scenario. We picture everything going smoothly, no unexpected hiccups, no last-minute changes. We forget that, well, life rarely works out that neatly.
Yeah, that's definitely me. I always imagine this perfect, streamlined process, and then reality hits, and it's like, bam, twice the time, twice the effort.
And the thing is, even when we try to be realistic, we often still underestimate. It's like our brains just can't quite grasp the true scope of a task until we're knee-deep in it.
So is there any hope for us terrible planners? Should I just accept that everything will always take longer than I think it will?
Well, there are definitely strategies you can try. One is to, really break down large tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks. That way, you can get a more accurate sense of the time required for each step.
That's a good idea. I guess sometimes I get overwhelmed by the big picture and don't really think through all the individual steps involved.
Right. And another thing is to, actively try to anticipate potential obstacles.
Yeah.
Think about what could go wrong, what might cause delays. Building in some buffer time for the unexpected can really help.
Okay, so more detailed planning and a little bit of pessimism sprinkled in for good measure.
Exactly. It's all about finding that balance between optimism and realism. Now, speaking of temptation, have you ever found yourself, reaching for that extra cookie even when you know you should be making healthier choices?
Oh, all the time. It's like my brain has a built-in go for the instant gratification button that I can't seem to resist.
That, my friend, is the delightful work of hyperbolic discounting. It's this fascinating tendency we have to prioritize immediate rewards over larger but delayed ones.
So that cookie in my hand right now is way more tempting than the abstract idea of being healthier in the future.
Exactly. Our brains are wired to value what we can have right now, even if it's not necessarily the best choice in the long run.
And this explains why it's so hard to save for retirement or stick to a workout routine or basically do anything that requires delayed gratification.
You got it. It's a constant battle between our present selves and our future selves.
So how do we win this battle? Are we doomed to always choose the instant cookie over the long-term health benefits?
Not necessarily. There are tactics you can use to outsmart your own brain. One is to try to reframe that delayed reward, make it feel more tangible and immediate. Instead of focusing on saving for retirement in the abstract, visualize yourself on that dream vacation you'll be able to afford with all that saved money.
Ooh, I like that. Make it feel real and exciting.
Right. Another thing is to create systems that make it harder to choose the immediate reward. Set up automatic savings contributions so the decision is already made for you. Or, maybe ask a friend to hide the cookies.
The cookie hiding might be the most practical solution in my case. Okay, so we can try to trick our brains into choosing the long-term good over the short-term temptation. But what about, navigating a world where there's just so much information coming at us all the time? How do we even know what to trust or what to focus on?
That's where another bias comes in, and this one is called base rate neglect. It's our tendency to get caught up in specific, vivid information while completely ignoring the broader statistical probabilities.
Okay, I'm not sure I'm following this one. Can you give me an example?
Sure. Imagine you read a news story about someone winning the lottery after playing the same numbers for years. You might be tempted to think, hey, maybe I should try that too. Maybe there's something to these lucky numbers.
Yeah, I can see the appeal of that.
Yeah.
But what's wrong with that logic?
Well, you're focusing on that one dramatic story, that one person who beat the odds. But you're ignoring the base rate, which is the statistical probability of winning the lottery, which, let's face it, is incredibly low no matter what numbers you choose.
So it's like we're letting a compelling anecdote cloud our judgment, even when the data tells a different story.
Exactly. The book actually uses this really interesting example to illustrate this. It's called the blue and green taxi cab scenario. It involves an eyewitness to a hit and run, the reliability of their testimony, and the prevalence of blue versus green cabs in the city. Even when presented with clear statistics about the number of blue and green cabs, people tend to get swayed by the eyewitness account and completely ignore the base rates, which leads them to make inaccurate judgments.
Wow, that's kind of scary.
Yeah.
So I guess the lesson here is to not get too caught up in the individual story, but to always consider the broader context, the bigger picture. Right.
Exactly. It's about thinking critically and not letting those vivid anecdotes overshadow the actual probabilities.
Okay, got it. Don't just jump on the first juicy piece of information. Zoom out and see how it fits into the larger data set. Makes sense.
Now you're thinking like a cognitive scientist. But be warned, there are still more biases lurking in the shadows, waiting to trip us up. And one of the most fascinating ones is something called anchoring bias. Are you ready for another mind-bending revelation?
Oh, absolutely. Bring it on. Lay some more wisdom on me.
All right, so imagine you're buying a used car. You walk onto the lot, and the seller, they immediately throw out a really high initial price.
Okay, yeah. Typical car salesman tactic, right? Start high, then negotiate down.
Exactly. But the thing is, even if you know that initial price is too high, it can still anchor your perception of a fair price. It's like that first number you hear sets the stage for all the subsequent negotiations.
So even if I know it's a ridiculous price, my brain still gets, like, stuck on that number.
It seems so. The book talks about this experiment where people were asked to estimate the answer to a multiplication problem. One group saw the numbers in descending order, and the other group saw them in ascending order. And guess what? The order they saw the numbers in actually influenced their final estimations.
Wait, seriously? Just the order they saw the numbers in changed their perception of the answer?
Yep. It highlights how susceptible we are to these subtle, unconscious biases. We like to think we're being all objective and rational, but our brains are constantly taking these mental shortcuts.
This is really making me question how much control we actually have over our own decisions.
Well, that's the first step, right? Becoming aware of these biases. But I think we need to give our brains a little break before we dive into even more mind-bending territory. Stay tuned for the final part of our deep dive into why we always believe we are.
Okay, we're back, and I'm ready for the final round of cognitive bias revelations. Hit me with your best shot.
All right, well, get ready for this one. Have you ever noticed how sometimes you hear a song and you're like, ugh, this is terrible. But then you hear it again and again, and suddenly you're like, wait, this is kind of catchy.
Oh, all the time.
Yeah.
There are so many songs on my playlist now that I absolutely hated at first, but, after hearing them a few times, they just grew on me.
That, my friend, is the mere exposure effect in action. It's this weird tendency we have to develop a preference for things simply because we've been exposed to them repeatedly.
So it's not even that the song got better, it's just that my brain started to like it because it became familiar.
Basically, familiarity breeds fondness, or at least tolerance. It's actually a pretty powerful phenomenon, and you see it everywhere, not just with music.
I bet advertisers use this all the time.
Yeah.
Right? Like, that's why we see the same commercials over and over again.
You got it. It's all about creating that sense of familiarity. The more we see a brand, the more we hear their jingle, the more likely we are to, at least subconsciously, develop a positive association with it.
So it's not just about remembering the brand. It's about actually influencing our preferences without us even realizing it.
Pretty sneaky, huh? And it's not just limited to advertising. Think about, how we form opinions about people. Sometimes we might start to like someone simply because we see them around a lot, even if we haven't really interacted with them that much.
Okay, that's kind of freaky. So how do we know if we're genuinely liking something or if it's just this mere exposure effect tricking us?
That's the million-dollar question. I think it's all about being aware of the effect and really checking in with yourself. Like the next time you find yourself drawn to something, ask yourself, is this a genuine preference or am I just responding to the repeated exposure?
Okay, I'll try to be more mindful of that.
Hmm.
But speaking of things that are hard to resist, I'm curious about something. What about those times when you just can't stop yourself from finishing a whole bag of chips even though you're not even really hungry anymore? Is there a bias behind that too?
There might be. It sounds like you're falling victim to unit bias. This is basically our tendency to want to complete a unit of something, regardless of the size.
So my brain sees that bag of chips as a single unit and it just wants to finish it, even if my stomach is already sending full signals.
Exactly. It's this weird drive for completion that kicks in. The book actually talks about this experiment where people were given different sizes of spoons to serve themselves M&Ms.
Okay, where's this going?
Well, the people with the larger spoons ended up eating significantly more M&Ms, even though their hunger levels were probably the same. It's like the size of the spoon, the size of the unit, influenced how much they felt they needed to eat.
That's wild. So even something as simple as the size of a serving container can influence how much we consume.
It can. And it's not just with food. You see this with, tasks, too. We tend to want to finish whatever unit we're working on, even if it means working longer than we planned or taking on more than we can handle.
This is making me really rethink my snacking habits and my work habits for that matter.
It's all about being aware of those subtle cues that influence our behavior. Maybe try, like, pre-portioning snacks into smaller containers to counteract that unit bias, or breaking down large tasks into smaller, more manageable chunks.
Okay, those are some good practical tips. But, sometimes I feel like my perceptions are just totally skewed by what's around me. Like when I'm shopping for clothes and suddenly a totally average-looking shirt seems amazing because it's hanging next to, like, the ugliest shirt I've ever seen.
Ah, yes, that's the classic contrast effect at play. It's this phenomenon where we perceive things differently depending on what they're being compared to.
So, like, that average shirt suddenly looks like a fashion masterpiece just because it's next to something truly hideous.
Exactly. Our judgments are relative. We're always comparing, whether we realize it or not. And this applies to more than just visual stuff. It can influence how we judge people, how we assess prices, even how satisfied we are with our own lives.
This is reminding me of that representativeness heuristic we talked about earlier, the one where we judge the likelihood of something based on how well it fits our stereotype, right? Like that Linda problem, where we all assumed she was more likely to be a feminist bank teller than just a bank teller.
I got it. These biases, they're all interconnected in a way. They're all about our brains trying to simplify complex information and make quick judgments, even if those judgments aren't always accurate.
And then there's that gambler's fallacy, where we see patterns in random events and think we can predict the outcome. Like if a coin lands on heads 5 times in a row, we assume it's due to land on tails next, even though the odds are still 50-50.
Right. It's like we can't help but look for order and meaning, even in chaos. Our brains just love patterns.
Well, this has been a truly wild ride through the world of cognitive biases. It's amazing how these little mental quirks, often operating below our conscious awareness, can have such a huge impact on our decisions and perceptions.
It really highlights the importance of, like, stepping back and questioning our own assumptions, right? The more we understand about how our minds work, the better equipped we are to make more informed, more rational choices.
So it's not about eliminating these biases altogether, because that's probably impossible, but it's about being aware of them and learning to mitigate their influence.
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of self-discovery and learning. And, this book, Why We Always Believe We Are Right, it goes into so much more detail about all these fascinating biases, like the acquiescence effect, which is our tendency to agree with others, even when we don't really believe what they're saying, or the sunk cost fallacy, where we cling to things we've invested in, even when it's clear we should just cut our losses and move on.
Well, I definitely need to go back and reread these excerpts now that I have this whole new lens to view them through. This has been a real eye-opener and honestly kind of humbling.
I agree. It's a good reminder that we're all a lot more irrational than we like to think. But hey, that's what makes us human, right?
That's one way to look at it. Well, to all our listeners out there, if you're as fascinated by these cognitive biases as we are, I highly recommend checking out Why We Always Believe We Are Right. It's a truly mind-bending journey into the inner workings of our brains and a powerful reminder that we don't always have as much control over our thoughts and decisions as we think we do. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, everyone. Until next time.